Right, good evening everyone, we are ready to start. Welcome at the LSE. My name is Filippo Dionigi. I'm a researcher based at the Middle East Center, and I've been given the pleasure of chairing tonight's event, which is organized by the LSE MENA Middle East and North Africa Students Union, if I, is that correct? Yes, Middle East. And the subject of tonight's talk is the Egyptian Revolution, and it is in occasion of the 5th anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution. Indeed, the hashtag of this conversation, if you want to tweet about it, will be #LSE January 25th, if you prefer. Our speakers are actually excellent speakers. The first one is Jack Shenker, who is an award-winning writer and journalist, and the former Egypt correspondent for The Guardian. He is the author of The Egyptians, a radical story, and he will be speaking for 15 minutes just like the other ones, and will be followed by Zeyad Salem, who is an Egyptian activist and the co-founder of the Alexandria branch of the No Military Trials for Civilians group. Is that correct? Yes? And then he will be followed by Nadine Marroushi, who is an Amnesty campaigner for the MENA program and a former Cairo-based journalist. We have also another speaker towards the end of our meeting, who will be Dr. Omar Ashour. Omar is an Egyptian-Canadian academic based at Exeter University, an associate fellow of Chatham House, and he's currently not here, but he's about to reach us in a few minutes or so. So he will be with us in a few minutes. I want to remind you also that the LSE MENA Students Union is holding this event as part of a series of events. It's going to be 6 parts, 6 events, and the second event will be on Wednesday, and it will be about Yemen and the revolution in Yemen, of course. And then the other events will be about Tunisia, Libya, and I'm assuming Syria as well, right? And Bahrain, of course. Yes, I always forget about Bahrain. But yes, surprise. And yes, so I think that's all about it. We should get started. 6:17. So over to you, Jack, and give you 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, and Daniel for inviting me. I'm really sorry that I'm late. I've been wandering around this kind of maze of building works, thinking of it as a sort of metaphor for revolution and counter-revolution, and how there's just endless twists and turns with no redemption. But we're here at last, and maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel. I'm just going to start with a few observations on how I feel the Egyptian revolution and counter-revolution is best conceptualized and framed, because I think that's one of the biggest front lines of the struggle for democracy and social justice in Egypt. The memory of revolution and the way in which the lens we use to describe it. And then I'm going to go very briefly into just some of the ways I've tried to kind of explore that framing myself. And then hopefully in the Q&A we can pick up on some of the more specific points. So the dominant narrative in recent years, I think we can all agree, is that far from being any kind of inspiration, Egypt is a textbook example of revolutionary failure, that mass protest and popular resistance ultimately fails and business as usual politics wins out in the end. It's a narrative that's certainly very comforting for elites inside Egypt's borders and for others beyond. But it's one that I think is profoundly misleading. In reality, the Egyptian revolution and counter-revolution are not events that can be isolated inside a space like Tahrir Square or inside a time period like early 2011. The waves of unrest we've seen in the past half decade are actually part of a far deeper ongoing historical process in which millions upon millions of not just Egyptians but citizens right across the Arab world are rejecting political exclusion, are rejecting economic exclusion, and are rejecting the state violence that goes hand in hand with both. They are muscling their way onto the political stage, and in the process they're coming up against rulers that cannot and will not change. Now that's a fundamental contradiction. It's not what stability looks like. It's what a prolonged moment of flux and change and disruption looks like. And I think we're at the beginning of that moment and not at the end. There is no doubt whatsoever that where we are right now in Egypt today is, when it comes to the scale of state repression, when it comes to the attacks on journalists, when it comes to the number of political prisoners, the scale of extrajudicial killings, the map of police torture, which covers the entire country, the degree of intimidation and the intolerance of opposition and dissent on the part of the regime, there is no doubt whatsoever that we're in a very, very dark place. So I don't for a moment want to deny the reality of that and present some kind of woolly, optimistic vision of utopia. But I think we mustn't miss the wood for the trees. The present situation, in which you have large sections of the population saying, we no longer accept these dire socioeconomic conditions and the political powerlessness that has been the status quo for so long. And you have regimes saying, we refuse to acknowledge any kind of democratic citizenry. We will fall back on the old tricks. We will fall back on chauvinistic hypernationalism. We will fall back on state violence. We will fall back on divide and rule. Again, as I say, that's not what stability looks like, no matter what President Sisi or his advisors like Tony Blair or his Western political allies like David Cameron might say. Anyone who thinks that this messy and awkward, and I would argue, despite all the travails, still beautiful flowering of popular sovereignty that we've seen in different forms in the past 5 years, anyone who thinks that that is over and that the pendulum won't swing again, I believe is deluding themselves. We can get into more detail on this in the discussion, but I think just as a pointer to some of the reasons for very, very cautious optimism, or at least a rejection of the pessimism that seems to be so prevalent in international media coverage of what's going on in Egypt at the moment, and these kind of cliches about the revolution being back to square one and it being game over for the young revolutionaries. I spoke to Hossam Bagat over the weekend, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He's one of Egypt's most prominent human rights defenders and now an investigative reporter with Madomos. And he made the point that this is a regime that undoubtedly secured a measure of popular support, especially in mid and late 2013, after the incredibly violent overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood's President Mohamed Morsi. And that support was predicated on a promise to provide security, or in the regime's words, kind of prosecute successfully this so-called war on terrorism, and provide people with higher standard of living and economic stability. Now, the regime has failed miserably on both fronts. I mean, if we leave aside for a moment the moral abhorrence of the regime's conduct, and even just take it on its own terms, it has failed on its own terms. Terrorism attacks are at an all-time high. Economic security is very, very far away. We are seeing a cut and paste copy of the economic system that was so fated by the West under Mubarak, and which led to revolution in the first place, and it's being trumpeted as some kind of new dawn. And the fact is that the more people see that Sisi's political power is untrammeled, he has the repressive state institutions kind of unified, below him. He has vast amounts of Gulf aid to assist him. The more they see these promises not being met, the more Egyptians realise that at least the ones who supported Sisi, the liberties and rights that they had sacrificed to receive this economic and security and this safety from terrorist attacks is not being delivered, the more questions are going to be asked. And we are seeing those questions asked. Last month, in November and December, we saw huge protests in Luxor and in Ismailia over police torture. We are seeing the Ministry of Interior day in, day out, having to completely disingenuously use the language of human rights, use the language of revolution to defend itself, because it knows that it cannot do anything else, because public anger is so, could potentially boil over. We're seeing cracks in the ruling regime. We're seeing rivalries between different branches of the security apparatus. We're seeing a puppet parliament that is clearly there to rubber stamp Sisi's executive authority, and yet even that puppet parliament has had to reject the civil service law because the state's bureaucrats have come out onto the street. We have seen labour strikes up and down the country. The police were on strike last summer, and so we saw one branch of the security forces tear gassing another. Now, that is not to say that another wave of revolution is going to break out tomorrow, but it does point towards the fundamental contradictions that the political status quo in Egypt at the moment is based upon. This is a regime that was once invincible, or at least thought itself to be invincible, and now knows itself to be profoundly vulnerable. And it's a model of autocratic state power that once seemed inevitable and timeless, and now seems archaic. And I believe that the levels of repression that we see today are a reflection of that. So I'll just finish up very quickly by explaining how I've tried to explore this in my own work, as was so brilliantly plugged. I have written a book called The Egyptians: A Radical Story, and I've tried to tell a story of the past half decade from the bottom up rather than the other way around. It's not about the elite machinations of the SCAF, Mubarak, then SCAF, then the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, and now Sisi's regime. It's about ordinary citizens in different parts of the country, most of whom live a very long way away from Tahrir Square, many of whom have reference points that are not about the 18-day anti-Mubarak uprising. People like the citizens of Damietta, who talk about the 11 days in late 2011 when they occupied their city, or the Bedouins of Dabar, which reclaimed a government nuclear site from the army for themselves, or the workers at Cleopatra Ceramics, which kicked out their boss, Mohammed Abu Anin, an old Mubarak regime crony, and started running the factory for themselves. Now, lots of these moments have been transitory. In the case of Cleopatra Ceramics, in the case of the Dabar Bedouins, the state or the old authorities are now very much back in control. But there has been a psychological shift that has come as a result of these processes. And as I've said before, this revolution was a hurricane, and is a hurricane, that has blown through the family dining room, the college lecture hall, and the school playground as forcibly as it has the corridors of government. So I try and explore those stories and tell those stories as a corrective to the very elite prism, which I feel like a lot of the international media and international commentators are based on. And I also see the revolution and counter-revolution not as processes which can be confined inside Egypt's borders, but are intimately enmeshed with kind of global patterns of governance and of resistance. We're living through a moment of really great instability, one in which the relentless expansion of markets over the past few decades has created a huge disconnect between citizens and states, not just in Egypt or the Middle East, but all over the world, in the global north and the global south. We've seen protests in the past half decade erupt everywhere from Santiago to Delhi to Istanbul to the Occupy movement in London and Cairo, London and New York. And we're also seeing, and I'm not lumping all of these things together, without any nuance or subtlety, but we're seeing the dissolution of national borders in the Middle East. We're seeing the rise of maverick politicians on both sides of the political spectrum, on both sides of the Atlantic. And we're now witnessing, hurtling towards us unstoppably, the second leg of a financial crisis that was never really resolved. Not all of these developments are progressive, far from it. It's very hard to say whether what will emerge from this period of instability is any more democratic and any more socially just than what's preceded it. But what I am sure of is that those that are most invested in the old ways are facing an existential battle for survival. And Egypt is on that battle's front line. that's why there has been such a concerted effort to sanitize the revolution, to frame it deceptively, to make it all about Mubarak or his successors or his elections, to talk only about a civil war between Islamists and secularists, or a fight between so-called Oriental backwardness and Western liberal modernity. Because the truth is that this revolution has hopes and warnings for us all. Egypt isn't all about prevailing power structures winning out in the end. And I do think that it's really important to stress that and to reclaim some of that optimism and some of that hope. And I think, as I say in the book, the rebellion in Egypt belongs to all those who seek a better world. And despite a huge amount of hardships, everything is still to play for. Thank you.
Thank you. That was perfectly on time. And Zeyad is...
I'm Egyptian, so I'm not sure about the time part. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Daniel for the invitation. It's usually, it's not really easy to talk about on this specific date, on this specific day, because you always feel like whatever you're gonna say, would you just say numbers? Would you talk about personal experience? Would you talk about people you lost? Would you talk about things you lost? It's a very different, and I think there is this kind of time loop that started in January 2011, and it never ended for most of us. Like, we still feel like we're still in the same place somehow, regardless what's happening, regardless what kind of oppressive regime we're dealing with, based with like in 2013 when we had the Muslim Brotherhood or afterwards. And at the end of the day, it's not really different, but again, there is always oppression, and there are those who are trying to make something else. So for now, what I'd really like to talk about is not Jan 25th in 2011 per se, because I think everyone knows a lot about that. But let's just take from Jack's words and think of a regime that is saying in every official statement that he upholds the Jan 25th revolution as one of the greatest things that ever happened. And just like I collected some news from the past 15 days, just 2 weeks. And you would see, so on the 7th of February, the president announced that they're building a new prison, which will be one of the biggest prisons in the Middle East. Lucky us. And then the following day, he would say that this year is going to be the year for the youth. So now we know that all the youths are going to be arrested. And then what happens is, all of a sudden, everyone who lives in downtown Cairo, which is the premises of Tahrir Square, would find people at 2 a.m. in the morning coming to their place, security forces, searching their mobiles and their computers and seeing what's happening. And if they do have a sticker or they have a photo they don't like or whatever, they're just going to arrest them. And the total number of those who were arrested over the past 24 days is 217 people were arrested. And what are they accused of? They're accused of an intention to protest on the 25th of Jan. An intention. So we're talking about a regime that right now is actually walking the street and find someone, and I have a feeling that you might do something, so I just arrest you. Like, that's easy. And not to mention the number of journalists that are in prison and people who are like, they disappeared. We have hundreds of people who've disappeared over the past 2 years. I remember maybe in 2011 at some point when we were at the square, and there was those down moments when everyone would be like, are we really going to do that? Is this really happening? And then everyone would bring the model of Latin America and how things went and the forced disappearances, and everyone would be like, no, not to that extent. And now we're living it. Maybe one of the things we've learned over the past 4 years is whenever you say about something that it's never going to happen because it couldn't happen, it usually does. So we don't do that anymore. That's one of the things we don't say. We never say not to this extent anymore. We have like 2 hours before I came here, I think it was 4:30 or something, and they arrested a guy at Hamad Mahmoud Street near Tahrir Square again because he was wearing a black t-shirt. So they said that, of course, he belongs to 6th of April movement, knowing that when Sisi came into power in 2013, one of the people he take photos with were the leaders of the 6th of April movement, who are now actually in prison serving times between 15 years, and some people are serving 7 years and 6 years, and for others, we've lost count because every other day you find a piece of news that there was this trial for them and they had 6 years more, 6 months more, and we don't know. So yeah, so this kind of environment doesn't tell you anything, but this is a very, very, very weak regime. And and even the fact that no one, I'm wearing black today, and that's what we've been doing over the past 4 years, that this day, we just wear black. Hopefully one day we'll wear another color, but for now, still on this day, we wear black. And the thing is, no one thought of going out or protest or anything. Not because people are afraid, because people are not afraid. There is a level of fear, but it's not as much as oppression. So people are not really afraid. But we're just like, this regime is this sort of regime that's actually attacking itself. It reminds me of, I remember in 2010, just like go back a bit, during Mubarak, we have this kind of schools that are semi-private schools in Egypt. And they've been there since, I guess, the early 1900s. And usually people who study there are middle class. They have nothing to do with politics. They have their lives moving on somehow. And then one day there was this kind of law that all the girls in this school will be removed and we'll have new administration for the school. So these girls, like they were 14, 15 years old, they made a sit-in in 2010 in their school so that no one would get them out of their school. And I remember someone said that day that the Mubarak regime is making new enemies every day. Hence, it's not gonna last. Same thing is happening now. You find like people who would be swearing by how they'll be secure, how they'll eat, how they love the new Suez Canal or whatever bogus project they're working on, and everyone will be happy. And now they're just making fun of him, and they're making fun of the regime, which says again, even if people need to somehow organize, need to somehow think in different ways to do other things or to reach out, but again, the masses are on our side again. And what's happening over the past, and I'm not trying to be hopeless optimist, but the thing is, I'm not. But the thing is, you have things that you look at. You find all of a sudden you have a whole country's army on the streets for no reason. They're scared, and it's obvious. And they're scared of what? Of like, they always talk about how we're totally useless and no one listens to us, and like, we're just living in our virtual spaces that no one even reads and we can't reach out to anyone. Yet, when Ala Abdel Fattah wrote a tweet, he's in prison. Like, if it's not that important, why are you doing that? If we don't mean anything to you, if we're not a threat, why are you doing this to us? So right now, yeah, it's this moment. It's very weird. And I've been thinking over the past few days of what I'm gonna say and what I'm gonna say again, or if I'm gonna be saying things that I've said last year and the year before. But then, luckily for me, Mahinur al-Masri, who I don't know if you guys know her, she is one of the most prominent Egyptian activists, and she's a very dear friend of mine. Now she's serving 15 months in prison. And yesterday she sent out a message because of the 5th anniversary of the revolution. And I think it answers a lot of questions, actually, even for myself, because it says a lot of things. So I'll just read it very, very fast. This is the 5th year of the revolution. I almost cannot believe that 5 years have passed since the chants of people want to bring down the system and dread freedom, social justice, human dignity. Maybe this is because even in my cell, I'm filled with dreams of freedom and hope. Some see that after all these years have passed, the revolution has been defeated. Others see that couldn't have been better. The regime, however, thinks that it has won. But is it the correct and decisive answer? Are we defeated and has the revolution ended? Have we always been nothing but victims? Maybe because I'm among the believers in the dream and among those who are convinced that we not only face internal authoritarianism and tyranny, but also an international system that is inhumane and to which people means nothing compared to profit and oil. I therefore see that we are still on a journey to build a humane and just society. We made mistakes sometimes. We were defeated others. We were arrogant at times and hopeless at many times, but we are still in the fighting ring. Glorification, however, is the voice of the stupid, and crying over the ruins is the voice of the cowardly and the desperate. These are lessons for everyone, lessons we learned by chaste blood that have been shed for us. The first of these lessons is there is no individual salvation, and that desperation and the attempts to escape to the outside or the inside will not help us make our day better. When we only see ourselves and start calling for freedom only for those we know, and didn't move for freedom for all the people, if we allow the regime to separate us from the street and from our goals, then they have won the last round. We are not satisfied with the honor of trying. We should not continue running in circles. We have to formulate the objectives of the revolution into movements and initiatives and begin organizing ourselves. If the interest of the counter-revolution unites us, then the survival instinct should unify us, believers in freedom and those who stand against all forms of authoritarianism and backwardness. A scared regime arrests thousands and cancels elections. They cancel the elections for the student union. They're cancelling whatever assembly there is, even if it's a concert in the street. It will get cancelled, and always for security reasons that no one knows what are exactly. It deepened the feelings of injustice, which strengthened the resistance. People who moved for 2 days of the 18th and 19th of January 1977, but did not touch the head of the regime, have learned the lesson and attempted to do away with the head of the regime in 2011. But this has not completed yet. And finally, revolution is ongoing as life, and dreams are ongoing. It does not stop for a person, and sooner or later, in our lives, or in the lives of those who came after us, our revolution will be completed, because people deserve better, and ugliness, no matter how much it tries to disguise itself, will eventually reveal its real face. At the end, there is Shaimaa Sabbagh, who was shot last year, like yesterday, on the 24th of January. So this is the first anniversary of losing her. And she tells her that, greetings to our angels and martyrs, tells them that we're still filled with hope, and that their prisons and their injustice increase nothing but our grip on our dream and our revolution. And I think I can
Thank you, Zeyad. Just a question. Am I correct to assume that that text is also available online?
It is, yes.
So
it's on the Facebook page of Free Mahinoon. It's in Arabic and in English.
Okay, thanks. I invite Dr. Ashour perhaps to join us in the panel if that's okay. And right after Zeyad, we have Nadine Marroushi, who have the floor now.
So I wanted to illustrate through some personal stories and examples of what 25th of Jan has been like on the ground over the last few years, and to illustrate what my colleagues Jack and Zeyad have been saying so beautifully, which is that 25th of Jan is not about a neat win or defeat by the revolutionaries, but rather an ongoing struggle between revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. And it has taken us to a situation today in which Egypt and the regime or the government is very much a contradiction of itself. So it has had to appropriate the language of 25th of January to the international community, whilst and sending out a message that it embraces 25th of January and celebrates it, whilst internally and inside Egypt, very much sending the opposite message, that 25th of January is a crime. And the way that we've seen it this year, in 2016, or the way I've seen it, is online through social media. So you've had the Ministry of Foreign Affairs launching a 5-day social media campaign called Egypt Better Today, in which it's celebrated the achievements of 25th of January. And at the same time, in the lead up to 25th of January this year, the Interior Ministry has launched its own media campaign, releasing videos through its Facebook page about crimes that the Egyptian people will not forget, including attacks against state buildings, the Raba al-Adawiya sit-in, in which at least 600 people were killed by the security forces, and yet they have painted it as a crime against the Egyptian people, and attacks against state buildings and churches. So to just take us back a few years and how this sort of contradiction has built up and how this struggle has progressed. I arrived in July 2011, so my first 25th of January was in 2012, and in fact I was in Alexandria. And I was working as a journalist at the time, reporting for a local newspaper called Egypt Independent. And it was amazing to see all the different groups that were down. I mean, thousands and thousands of people were in downtown Alexandria on that day. And actually one of the first people I met was Mahinoud Mosli, who, as Zeyad said, is one of the most prominent activists in Egypt and a human rights lawyer. And she was with, naturally, groups of workers who, and fellow revolutionary socialists who very much saw that day about a day of protest, that it was not something to celebrate, that the struggle very much continued, workers' rights had not yet been achieved, the slogan of bread, freedom and social justice had not yet been achieved, Mubarak's regime hadn't completely fell yet. So for them, there was still so much to struggle for. And that's what they were there for, to kind of send that message out and to continue protesting, even though actually Mahyanur said, we shouldn't just be down on the streets protesting, but rather should be organising ourselves and working around movements and initiatives, as she has very much said till now in her letter. And on the other side of downtown Alexandria were thousands of Muslim Brotherhood supporters and members who were very much celebrating on that day because they had just been through the parliamentary elections and had won a majority of seats. And for them, one Muslim Brotherhood member was saying to me, who would have thought we would have brought down Mubarak and defeated the security forces? So they were very much in celebratory mode. And then a few meters away at military barracks in Alexandria, you had Salafis who were there calling for presidential elections. They just wanted to race toward the elections and elect a leader. So 2012, it was a very healthy contestation of what it was about, what the struggle was about. But you did have a struggle between people who still wanted change and revolutionary change and to struggle from the below, and others who were just very keen to get to the ballot box and hold on to power. A year later, 25th of Jan 2013, I was in Tahrir, and the experience there was very different to the year previous, and a struggle on a very different level. 25th of Jan 2013, I volunteered with an initiative in Tahrir called the Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment Initiative. It was formed by groups of activists who basically wanted to make Tahrir a safe space for women. In the lead up to that anniversary, you had reports of women being mob sexually assaulted in Tahrir and on the fringes and the streets around it. So activists had formed to try and basically make the square safe. But that night, at least 19 women were sexually assaulted by mobs of men, including one woman who was raped with a knife. And to this day, I don't know, who those men were, who those mobs were. They were certainly organised. But for me, it still symbolises this revolutionary and counter-revolutionary space and a struggle for space on many different levels, including women claiming their rights to be in Tahrir and to claim a space for themselves, and those who basically use women as a way to basically terrorize and use and traumatize what Tahrir actually means for people and the memory of it. 2014, you had a summer of mass protests, but also mass violence. We had leading up to Rabaa Adawiya, which I said was a sit-in that was eventually broken up by the security forces, police backed up by the army. They killed up to 1,000 people across the country, and a conservative estimate of more than 600 just in Rabaa. And in 25th of Jan 2014, leading up to that, you had people who gathered around Sisi, who wasn't president then, he was leader of the army, giving him a broad mandate to fight a war on terror. And in this vast crackdown, in this vast war on terror that was launched, so many people were dragged into that, including journalists. And in fact, on 25th of January 2014, you had prior to that, the arrest of the Al Jazeera journalists. And that really shifted the mood in Egypt. And suddenly journalists became the front line on this war on terror. And I know this through my own personal experience because I went down to Tahrir that day to report. And in fact, on that day, the police, the Interior Ministry, had called on people to go down to the squares and celebrate 25th of January. So you had so many people who were in Tahrir who were hyper-nationalistic mode, who had just voted in for the constitution, who were getting ready for Sisi to become president. They were calling on Sisi to become the leader of the country. And so I was interviewing a woman who called herself the bride of Sisi. She was so enthusiastic about, wanting Sisi to be the leader of Egypt, and she called herself the bride of Sisi. Very weird. And as I was interviewing her about why was she in Tahrir and what was she there for, etc., an ordinary man came up to me. He was in his, maybe mid-40s, and said, why are you here? And I had never been asked that question before, really. Like, you do get the odd person, but in that slightly aggressive tone, why are you here? So I said, well, I'm here to do my job. I'm a journalist, asking questions, finding out why people are here. And out of the blue, he accused me of working for Al Jazeera. And at the time, this word Al Jazeera was so charged. It had huge implications. It meant that, according to nationalist propaganda, you were a traitor, you represented Qatar, you were part of the Muslim Brotherhood propaganda against Egypt. And he kept repeating that louder and louder. And even when I got my press card out to show that I wasn't working for Al Jazeera, he just wouldn't look at it and wouldn't believe what I was saying. The louder his accusations got, the more the mob formed around me, and I got attacked for doing my job along with another journalist. We survived to tell the tale, but it really showed me how the struggle for space, no matter who you were, was getting even more restricted by this increasingly nationalist propaganda, even for a journalist to tell a story, to freely roam around and ask questions was becoming incredibly dangerous. Surprise, surprise, 2015, I wasn't there, but I was in Egypt, but I didn't report from the square. And as Zeyad said, on that day, on the eve of 25th of January, you had the killing of Shaymat Sabah. And she was only going to lay a wreath of flowers in the square to commemorate those who died. And she was shot in broad daylight by a police officer. Which, obviously symbolically says huge things. The police chief at the time had to resign. I mean, her killing was captured by so many journalists at the time. Pictures went viral on social media. But unfortunately, he was replaced in March by an even more brutal head of the police, Interior Minister. His name is Megdi Abdelghafar. And since then, I joined Amnesty International as a campaigner. And we've documented a resurgence of the National Security Agency, in which enforced disappearances have become a common thing. One local human rights organisation documented 340 cases of enforced disappearances over a period of 4 months, equating to 3 disappearances a day. And what that actually means is that a person gets arrested from their home, taken to a place, an unknown secret place of detention where they don't have access to their family or a lawyer, and in which torture takes place in order to extract confessions, and then most likely that person gets put through an unfair trial. It's been an absolutely brutal year when it comes to human rights and the crackdown on freedoms. So much so that we have gotten to a situation now where even in the lead up to 25th of January, the security services forces have launched such a broad campaign, going around 5,000 apartments in downtown Cairo, arresting someone who, as Zeyad said, even has an inclination to protest. And as a result, you have Cairo, which was described to me today as a ghost town, despite the images on social media of a few pro-Sisi's down in Dahin celebrating, but it's become a ghost town. But that's not to say that that the revolution has been defeated. Far from it, because as I said in the beginning, because of 25th of January, because of the power that people have displayed on the streets and also online to bring about change, the government has had to adopt this contradictory approach, one in which it says it celebrates 25th of January and the achievements of 25th of January, but in fact it's so scared of what 25th of January represents that it has had to launch such a brutal crackdown internally. And the reason why it also has to kind of claim that language to an international audience is because the regime is so desperate to claim legitimacy on an international stage. We've seen Sisi doing a grand tour of Europe this year. And unfortunately, it has actually been successful. Egypt is being welcomed on the international stage. It is regaining its legitimacy. And I think when we sit here in London at the LSE as British citizens or as non-British citizens, but basically we're in the UK, we should be thinking about the role that we can and should be playing in the UK, and I hope we can talk about that more in the Q&A, because as Jack said, it is part of a global struggle, and the UK is very much implicit in entrenching the human rights crisis that's taking place in Egypt today. The government, the British government, has been cozying up to the Egyptian regime. It has sold arms in 2015 to the Egyptian government. There have been delegations back and forth. And interestingly, and that's not surprising, the British government has never been a revolutionary force, particularly when it comes to Egypt. And we can talk more about that, but I have a good couple of examples. Like one of the laws that still bans protests in Egypt, the 1914 law, was put in place by the British administration. In 1919, the British killed more than 800 Egyptian protesters who were seeking self-determination. So it's not surprising that the British government is playing this role now, this counter-revolutionary role. And in fact, the British ambassador's blog today on the 25th of January was quite shocking to me. In his third paragraph, he quoted a man called Murtada Mansour, who once told The Guardian that 25th of January was the worst day in Egypt's history. So it is, when we think of it in those terms, the revolution in Egypt is part of a global struggle, because it's upon us to also call on our government and our leaders and say, the approach you're taking is not good enough, and that we will continue to press on you to meet the people's demands for human dignity. And I think that's it then.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Dr. Omar Ashour. Over to you.
Thank you. First, apologies. I had to rant a bit against Sisi and Al Jazeera, so I guess that makes me a traitor, an atheist, and a member of the Muslim Brothers at the same time. I was supposed to speak about Sinai, the Muslim Brothers, and security sector reform, but Nadine's talk just poked on so many wounds. So I have to say a few things. She mentioned Murtada Mansour, so this is his latest, or the latest quote that was disseminated around lately. These kids, meaning the protesters, should be arrested in a matter of 24 hours. And we can get them by getting their mothers, their sisters, and their wives. Whoever tells me human rights, I will hit him with my shoes. My words are clear. We should get their mothers, now their fathers, gender equality, and their wives. So this is the head of the Human Rights Committee. And in the current Egyptian parliament and a former judge. So it gives you an idea of the type of the regime that people like Mahmoud al-Masri and many of the protesters are up against. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, when Nadine was giving her excellent presentation, I was just thinking, was there a way to avoid what was happening? And I just kept on looking at some of my pictures back from the 2011-2013 experience, and one of them was this picture. These are the presidential candidates back in September 2011. It's from the very far right, so Hazem Ismail, the Salafi candidate, to the, I wouldn't call it a lefty, but national leftist kind of thing, Hamdin Sabahi, who's not national leftist of the Nazis, but something different. Anyway, so the left and the right, and then you had the guys who were centrist in one way or another, so Amr Musa, Baradei, and others. Yeah. And then the other picture, that was us, some of the activists, basically gathering those gentlemen, the presidential candidates. It was Wael Ghanim, if some of you know of him, the Google activist. It was Khaled Nabawi, who's an actor, an actor that did a really nice role in front of Sisi, which was, talk about that maybe, I'm not going to talk about that. And myself, a couple of others. And we were basically talking about one thing that I studied a bit, democratic transition. I know how they can fall apart and end up in disasters, or how do they progress. And especially the way I characterize what happened in January 2011 was a bit different from all of my colleagues and friends were arguing against that. It was an uprising that led to a military coup and against a dictatorship. And the military coups against dictatorships usually engender a period where you have a chance, you can maneuver with the military. But it really depends on how you maneuver. And you can have, you can have another military coup that ends up all the games, like the war games, and they should have been celebrated. You had games like Egypt this was the first time ever where you have these kind of basic freedoms in Egypt. It never happened before. The first time ever when you had a clear ballot box, free, fair elections. Not before 52. Before 52, women were not even allowed to vote. After 52, of course, women and men, their vote did not matter. So that was the only period where actually you had a clear ballot box, or a clean ballot box. And you toppled, and you should by no means undermine this, but you toppled a significant part of the regime, which was the head of the regime, Mubarak, and some of its main men, whether on the security services, so Habib al-Adli and those guys, the Minister of Interior, were inside prison, and some of the businessmen corrupt businessmen who were also very strong element of the formula were there. So our main argument back then to all these 7 presidential candidates were 2 things. One, you should ask the SCAF, who are the junta, who are the coup plotters, to give back power to civilian as fast as possible. Okay. Second was whoever wins among you. Morsi and Shafiq were not running at that point. Like they did not declare their candidacy yet. But whoever wins should make like if you wish, like a code of conduct or something. Should not use the armed elements or the armed institutions of the state against his political rivals. Because that was one of my main worries, that you really don't end with a civilian control of the armed forces or a democratic control of the armed forces, but they would think, whoever politician is up there, would think that he would use the armed forces against his rivals. And what really was going on, given Egypt's history and given the military institutions' history of authority in the country, the military will be using them to just stage a fight against their own political rivals. So they all promised that. They were fine with that. And I remember, I can say that now, Amr Musa's office sent a message to the SCAF with these 2 demands. They did not even reply to him. And this is a guy who was a foreign minister of Mubarak. He was the head of the Secretary General. He has very good relations with all these generals in this camp. So he was the closest to the status quo that you want to send a message via him. And they ignored him. And these guys put together back then, there were about 90% of Egypt's votes. So 90% of Egypt's vote, the guy was very close to the status quo, and a simple message: hand over power and get the arms out of politics. There was no reply, and some of them got scared after there was no reply and did not even show up in a public conference that was demanding these simple demands. Simple in the terms, but of course revolutionary objectives. So this is what was a. The rest is history, right? What happened is another guy won. The polarization was so extreme. There was no non-violent conflict resolution mechanism. This side mobilizes, that side mobilizes, sometimes clashes, sometimes no clashes. And then one side, the army just used one side against the other. And then they're back in power. But the regime really has changed. This is not Mubarak regime. Anyone who would think that really needs to look to dissect this regime. This is a regime where you have the military council as the most powerful political and economic player in it. It's not the NDP or Mubarak ruling businessmen or the security apparatus under the Ministry of Interior. It's the military command, so they don't have a Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which is an unconstitutional body, by the way. If you look at 1971 Constitution during the uprising, it doesn't exist there. So that body, which is the command of the army, and then its main think tank, the military intelligence. Think tank is an outrage. The amount of conspiracy theories that they act upon is just ridiculous. And then below them, the other security apparatus, so the state security apparatus, the general intelligence apparatus. And so far, they don't have a political power machine, so they don't have the NDP yet. The NDP represents almost opposition at that time. And if you looked at how the elections, the latest parliamentary elections that brought us this guy, how it was run, you would see basically the security services are trying to have the political arm and try to maximize the numbers of MPs that are loyal to them. So the general intelligence had its own entity, and some of the independent candidates, military intelligence, the same thing. State security, which now renamed national security, has the same thing. So a different kind of regime, much more aggressive compared to Mubarak. It shoots directly, as we saw, and doesn't take any chances. Basically, the hawkish elements of Mubarak regime look like Mother Teresa compared to these guys, because they believe that Mubarak's problem was that he allowed the margin of tolerance, and he allowed some activism to go on, even if it was small, even though he allowed 88 MPs, invitations of the Muslim brothers to go in the parliamentary elections, to run in parliamentary elections, then win and enter the parliament. So all of these they consider a mistake, and therefore the counter reaction is to crack down hard and put them in court. So when you have a regime like that, the opposition also changes. And also this is the first time in Egypt's history, even during the British colonial period, that you have that level of opposition outside of the country, both in terms of quantity and quality. There are no stats, but somewhere between tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of Egyptians left the country after the coup, like 2015. And in terms of quality, it's a very high level. You have former ministers, you have a vice president, like Mohamed Baradei, former vice president, appointed by the military, still a vice president at one point. You had MPs, you have well-known journalists, well-known activists, a significant bloc outside of the country. Inside, of course, you have the protesters who were the youth forces, basically, which is very idealistic, moralistic, has the moral high ground on one end, decentralized, less numbers, easier to crush, You have the Muslim Brothers, which is we can talk more about that, but very briefly, right now there are 4 major factions, and ideology is not really that much of a matter there, but just a faction that wants to change everything, change the leadership, change the tactics, change the curricula, and maybe change the objectives as well. And then another faction that wants everything to stay as it is, leadership stays, tactics stays, curricula stays, the objectives also stays. The objectives meaning even Morsi comes back. It's, even for, they would argue for half an hour to give over power and so on, but everything stays as it is, nothing changes. And then in the middle you have 2 other factions that would change one or the other. Of course, sometimes it is portrayed as the tactics use civil resistance as the pre or during 2011 and pre-2011, so demonstrations, sit-ins, or use armed tactics. And that is there, but it's not also the main issue of the and then briefly on the insurgency.
3 minutes, yeah.
3 minutes. Okay. Very briefly on the insurgency. Sinai, this is Egypt's strongest insurgency also ever. This is the first time when you have an armed non-state actor which has the capacity to act like the special force unit, has the capacity to use anti-aircraft guided missiles, anti-tank guided missiles, heavy artillery, light artillery, attacking formations similar like more or less special force formations, and then retreat at the same time, while covering the retreat quite well with a mix of snipers, light artillery, and mines. So they know what they're doing, and first time also to be able to control some territory, and that's the case in the south of Rafah, south of Shenker. It's a very small territory, so we're talking about 1/3 of one governorate of Egypt, and North Sinai, I think it's the 3rd least populous governorate in the country, so not a major, very much a periphery, but of course Sinai, so very strategic at the same time. With an incapacity, and on the other end, you have a state that is not held by any, or a regime that is not held by any standards, legal standards, moral standards, any kind of international pressures, nothing. So therefore, it looks at this area as a scorched earth tactic. Raising down of houses, Human Rights Watch documented 3,200 and something buildings raised down in the area. Basically, the villages that are suspects of insurgent activity there, leveled to the ground, using F-16s in residential areas in Rafah and Sheikh Zayed, so far from the border, a bit far from the border. Using heavy artillery inside Aish in residential areas with a city. So basically did everything. If you looked at the power ratios there, it's just it is very difficult to understand how the insurgency survived, because we're talking about 1 fighter versus 500 soldiers. This is in terms of the numbers that are there. So quite a very complex situation. It's still a puzzle for me, and I studied insurgency for a long time. This is still I'm trying to understand the methods by which they survive and be able to come back after each and every attack. And very briefly on security sector reform, there is nothing going on. All of the efforts that were done between 2011 and 2013, I was involved in them directly, whether with the Parliament's National Security Committee or with the presidential establishment after the election of Morsi. All of that is shuttled, of course, and one member of the team, also an academic, was involved in the processes, went to, after the coup, went to Hazem Bidlawi, the Prime Minister who was appointed then, and told him, we have this stuff, we've been working on it for a while, we have, guys, and Hazem Bidlawi told him that this is not the right time, this is war time. So, and I will end on that.
Thank you very much. Right. thank you very much to all the speakers. We have plenty of time to hear from you. We are welcoming questions and comments, please, short and to the point and relevant for the subject of our discussion. Please identify who you are and also who you are asking your questions or towards what actually you are commenting on. Hands up, and I'll be happy to. Yes.
My name is Adelaide Arthur, student of the University of Westminster. And I have one question for you. You said, I want to find out, do you miss Mubarak because you're saying that Sisi's regime is much more aggressive than what you have now? And also, do you think that with the situation in Sinai, has Egypt become more vulnerable to terrorism? And then I have one question here. I don't know who will answer this, but you voted for Muslim Brotherhood. So why didn't you wait for the attempt to end before overthrowing them? Because don't you think that by overthrowing them, the coup has actually worsened the situation now? You voted for him, so wait for his term to end before, so you allow the Egyptian people to vote for another person. But why overthrow him? And then Sisi comes, and now you don't like Sisi.
Okay, we got your points. Any other questions? Hands up. Anyone else? Okay, so we start with this one. I think the first question was for Omar, right? For the right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Miss Mubarak, he reminded me of a friend of mine. I was telling him, man, should we say, there was this slogan for the Mubarak loyalists when the revolution happened, that I'm sorry, Mr. President. So I was joking with this friend, and telling him, should we now say, we're sorry, Mr. President? And this friend is a bit older, so he said, no, we should say, we're sorry to the Queen for the British colonialism, and it was there. We want to bring her back. But that's all a joke. So, no, I don't miss Mubarak. Mubarak was a corrupt dictatorship who also tortured people, who also was a main reason for the uprising to happen, for a fair uprising to happen. What I truly miss is the period between 2011 and 2013, but it should have ran in a different way. It's the same thing when many people in Egypt would tell you, before 52 you had the king, the British forces, and the parliament, or the three powers, and after 52 you had the military, so maybe 52 coup was wrong. And my argument is that no, it was not wrong. The king was a corrupt dictator as well, but you had the period between July 52 to November 54 just went wrong. It was a transition period that you could have ended with a democratic transition and a successful institutionalized democracy. You had a good constitution in 54. It was produced, draft constitution that was never ratified. And one historian, Salah Isa, found it in a trash bin in the Arabic think tank. But it was, if you looked at it, it was an excellent constitution. If it was implemented, then we would have had something different after 54. But transition periods, unfortunately, in Egypt failed twice. And it tells you also about the quality of the, unfortunately, the politicians. But no regrets. Whether opposition to Mubarak or to Sisi, no regrets.
Thanks. And you're all Muslim Brotherhood voters, I guess?
Well, I didn't vote for either to begin with, so I'm not to be blamed with the Muslim Brotherhood thing. But what I want to say is, because it's always very easy, looking back or looking from afar, you should have done that. You've done that. Why don't you do that? But life is not like this. Like at the end of the day, there are many, many factors that usually intersect and interact and lead to things that not necessarily the best outcome of it, but by the time it seemed right, or it seemed the lesser of two evils, which we've been playing with since 1952, I guess, with the lesser of two evils. We're always going for the lesser of two evils, or what we think is the lesser of two evils. Why didn't people wait? Well, it was on the table at some point, the idea that maybe wait for a few months and then have another transition period, or have presidential elections, but like earlier than when it should be. But the thing is, it was many factors. You were going out of time where you had momentum, or you thought you had momentum. You had many actors or players playing in many different ways to reignite this momentous kind of victorious feel. Plus, there is something that I personally think exists in Egypt, and is one of the reasons why we are where we are right now, which is it's basically a generation gap. I would remember in 2011 during the first referendum thing in March, someone who would be like 50-something, and he would just say the opposite of what I'm saying so that I don't feel happy about myself. It was a generation that they don't really have an argument. But for a moment, they felt like, okay, we're not going to be following some kids. And if everyone is celebrating them, it's good for them. But at the end of the day, we're the older people, we know better. And most of the decisions that involved any democratic transitions was mostly directed by this generation. And another thing is having a revolution or an uprising or whatever we want to call it, or having a coup, whatever we want to call it. You can't, 3 months afterwards, expect to have presidential elections and it will be rigged. Yes, it wasn't tampered, but elections are like the last step of a democratic process that no one knew what it was like. We would talk and say things, but people like the masses of people, they have no idea what that means. They don't know what to expect from a president. They don't know how to choose a candidate to begin with. They don't know. So the fact is, we had this kind of, after 2011, I assume, we were forced into a make-believe system that let's all pretend we're having a transition period, let's all pretend there's a democratic process that happened over a course of 3 weeks. And then a year afterwards, okay, let's go to the box, to the ballots and just like vote. And things don't work this way. Like even in Europe, it took years to establish a democratic process that at the end would lead to a ballot boxing and people like voting and stuff. And it's still questionable at times of how people are actually influenced. So what would you expect of a country with, I wouldn't be exaggerating if I say like 50 to 60% of those who live there who constitute 60 or 70% of the voting power. They're either illiterate or they have no idea what they're voting for. So yeah, I don't know if it's an answer.
Any other comments on this?
I'm not Egyptian, so I didn't vote for the Muslim Brotherhood. But you have to remember the mood and the context of the time. So the choice for the presidential elections were between someone who was very much a part of the Mubarak regime or something new, which people hadn't fully tested in power. And for many people, including people I know, and it's surprising that they voted for the Muslim Brotherhood, but they did vote for Morsi because he represented something new. At least it wasn't a step back. It was seen at the time as a step forward. And then after the election, of course, in December 2012, you had the Morsi, you had the constitutional amendments in which Morsi, as president, put himself above the law. And no one really saw. So you had Morsi put him above the law that ignited lots of street protests and violence. And also, as his government progressed through time, many people saw that he was making decisions, his government was making decisions for a particular group of society. And it wasn't an inclusive one. You know, different parts of the political spectrum didn't see that they were being included in the political process. Plus, you had very little police reform, and maybe Omar can talk to us a bit more about that. But you know, you either had a withdrawal or a lack of presence of the police, or not much police reform at all. Reports of torture were still going on in Egypt's prisons. And let's not forget, Morsi was the one who appointed President Sisi, and therefore was quite keen to keep quite a strong alliance with the army. And all of that, of course, contributed to an atmosphere where people were very frustrated. A petition that started off from an unknown group calling for early presidential elections that in the end mobilized hundreds of thousands of people. And people had just been through the 2011 uprising, and so they felt that they felt empowered and that they could bring about change, and that for people who wanted, you know, change to continue, thought this would be a quick process. Why wait for the downfall of a government that was proving counter-revolutionary in government? So people quickly mobilised, but unfortunately it has turned slightly sour. But that's not the end of the game. So.
Well, yeah, I believe it or not, like Nadine, I didn't have a vote, unfortunately, in the 2012 presidential elections. But just to add to what these guys have said, Zeyad mentioned that elections are only the last step of the democratic process, and I completely agree with that. And I'd say, adding to that, they're also only the first step. Morsi was undoubtedly a democratically elected president. I met somebody from the Muslim Brotherhood on the stairs, and I'm sure, I assume you may disagree with what I'm about to say. Morsi was not a democratic leader. He was an autocrat who used his office to insulate himself and from the wider state from the revolution's storms. He attempted to utilise the repressive institutions of the state, which revolutionaries were working to dismantle and to reform. Time and time again, he protected that apparatus, that security apparatus. He protected the economic system that, again, revolutionaries were trying to dismantle and reform in the name of economic justice and social justice. And I think when you do that, when you appoint the very repressive figures which so tragically and so outrageously and so wrongly then turned on the Muslim Brotherhood and unforgivably committed horrific acts of violence against their supporters by the thousands. But when you do those things, you give up the right to call yourself a Democrat. And of course, I say the same about Sisi as well, who also, albeit in an election which was full of intimidation and oppression and, followed, only a few months after he massacred 1,000 of his political opponents in a single day, so you could hardly call it a fair election, but procedurally it largely was a fair election. That doesn't make Sisi a Democrat any more than it made Morsi a Democrat. Morsi absented himself, and the Muslim Brotherhood leadership absented themselves from the democratic process, and in a revolutionary context, I can understand why many Egyptians from all walks of life, and not just, and this is really important to stress, not just shadowy figures from the state's old guard, even though they were present too, but many people genuinely took to the streets, and I'm not just talking about the 30th of June, I'm talking about throughout the first half of 2013. You had protests up and down the country against, as Nadine said, Morsi's counter-revolutionary rule. Now we can have a debate, and we should have a debate, about whether the revolutionary strategy at that point was wisest to once people realised that essentially the steel heart of the old state was mobilising to manoeuvre Morsi out of the way and reclaim power for themselves, as I think was becoming obvious by late June. You can argue we should have a debate. Was revolutionary strategy at that moment right to come out on the 30th of June and kind of support that process or not? That's a debate to be had, but when you ask the question, why did people not allow Morsi to finish his term, continue to rule as a Democrat and to evict him from the democratic process? It's because I think he evicted himself from the democratic process.
Yes.
I don't know where to start because I had this debate so many times before. But just very briefly. So first, about the illiterate people. This is an urban upper middle class myth in Egypt that actually the peasants in the outside of the country does not know their interests or how to vote. It's not like that. Egypt has 51 million voters. The largest number of votes turnout was 26-point-something million. This is in the parliamentary elections of 2012. So basically half of the country doesn't vote, and it's not just the poor and the little. And this is when things were free and fair. And this 26 million, they are extremely, if you look at the voting behavior, one, extremely diverse and divided. Two, extremely sensitive to whatever goes on. So you can win this time and then 3 months later, everything changes in different ways. And in terms of economic interests, they know their economic interests. And whoever has doubts, just look at the map. Luxor in Upper Egypt, this is the area where lots of tourists go. Very high illiteracy rate, still impoverished, as opposed to the rest of Upper Egypt, which is quite conservative and suffered under Mubarak. So the rest of Upper Egypt voted Morsi, won in all of that region. Luxor, because of the economic interest, voted Shafiq, voted continuity. South and North Sinai, same thing. So North Sinai, the pressure under Mubarak, lack of unemployment, lack of touristic resources, lots of problems, voted change, most higher than higher than the average in Egypt. I think 60% or more, 61%. South of Sinai, also high level of Bedouin tribes, illiteracy, but much higher unemployment, but some touristic tourism basically created a wider, more inclusive economic system for the Chile. So, here are the illiterates outside of the urban areas and knowing where they go. So, and the continuity of it, because you learn in the process. The democracy won't, as Zeyad mentioned, it's not just this 3 months that you will learn everything. The continuity of the process will make you learn and by experience. So that's on one end. On the other end, I don't know if any of you met Morsi in the presidential palace. You did? So in the presidential palace, I visited there quite a few times. Every time I go there, first, the treatment is not nice in general. You're meeting with either the president or somebody who's in the presidential system. And the first and second time, the coffee came an hour late and cold. Just so the guy did not really control that much, aside from the conspiracy theories and everything, did not control even the presidential palace. One issue in Port Said, because Port Said, I was extremely angry about what happened in Port Said. Remember, in 2012 there was 2013, I think, major crackdown in Port Said, and about more than 50 people got killed. In Port Said, he summoned an officer, a loyalist officer in the police force, Morsi. That officer, his rank is Lieutenant Brigadier General. So Brigadier General, between him and Morsi, so between him, around 2,000 officers. Between a Brigadier General in the Ministry of Interior until the Minister of Interior, there was about 2,000 officers in total. So he summoned this guy just to let him know what's happening in Port Said, because the rest of the information was not very suspected. So you had a serious crisis in terms of the actual powers in there. Not to vindicate Morsi from major policies that were disastrous and major decisions, including of course the decision of Sisi and the decision of the using a language that was extremely polarizing and what happened in the Constitutional Assembly. So a million things that went wrong. But in particular matters that has to do with how things ran, there was a major problem in the system. And it was not part. The only way to empower it was to keep it continuing. The only way to empower it is not to, because that's a conversation I had on 28th of June 2013, before the coup, with one of the leading figures who were very much supportive of what's happening on 30th of June. And I basically mentioned that what guarantees you have. It was a diverse crowd, as Jack said, very diverse. I told them there is nothing that links you with the NDP, Mubarak's party's loyalists that are going down. Nothing that basically you and your group, compared to number one, the army, the most powerful, the most resourceful, under it the Ministry of Interior, security apparatus, under it the NDP, this is the food chain if you wish, under it the NDP loyalists, the businessmen, the media tycoons, all of these, and then you. So how are you going to, let's say the system also fails, now everybody is going to go to jail, there's a coup, how are you going to control all of the above? What kind of powers do you have? These elements, the army, the NDP, will win in a free and fair elections against this guy who represents part of the pro-revolutionary youthfulness. So it was just it was a really idiotic strategy to do something like that, and basically legitimate politically a coup, and then declare that it's not a coup, and then try to think that the general is going to take orders from you. I think it was, compared to all of Morsi's mistakes, that was a much bigger one. And finally, the matter of expectations. I didn't expect anything from her. I didn't expect much from Morsi. All what I wanted to do is have a period where the actual democratic process moves on one step, and then the next round, the Muslim brothers would have probably lost in the parliamentary elections, and you had a elite parliament back then, not like Mubarak, so actual powers. prime minister had actual powers compared to the president. And then in the presidential elections, I don't think that given the pattern of vote changing that was very, very rapid in the period of between March 2011 and December 2012, all these changes in the votes, I think the next elections we wouldn't have won, but you at least maintain the constitutional democratic system that we fought for and so many people died for.
Okay, so hands up, please. We have a question here. Yeah, you sir.
Hi, my name is Omar Ashour, unrelated to the other. I just wanted to ask how dependent do you think Sisi's government is on foreign governments, especially UAE, and whether his government will be able to survive without their funding in aid?
Can we take a couple more and then we'll go ahead? Okay, and yes?
Yeah, actually, it a little bit relates to the question as well. It's just because Egypt is increasingly becoming a black box, so it's really difficult to know what people and specific social groups are actually thinking inside of Egypt from the outside. So I wanted to ask you, how isolated do you believe the government actually is right now in Egypt, both from foreign governments such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who we can see certain tensions right now between Sisi government and them, but also from like the business community. We've seen the arrest of Zeyad, for example, and other parts of the security apparatus, like Jack mentioned earlier. So how isolated is the military leadership compared to the rest of society and even internationally?
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Mahmoud. I study here in Egyptian.
And then there was a hand back there. Yes, the lady in the back there. Can you speak up a little? We can't hear you.
I have a question about Sinai. Well, two questions actually. The first is, aren't the military aware by now that their brutal crackdown in North Sinai on the community, which is not only has had its own raised, but has actually had civilians raised to the ground, aren't they aware by now that that in some way perhaps in the long run will actually fuel more terrorism, so-called terrorism? Specifically of many individuals or other groups affiliated with Sinai province. I also have a question about, you may not want to answer this, which is about the journalist, Alexandria.
Can you, sorry, what's it?
I don't know if anyone knows the journalist, Ismail or Ishmael Alexandria.
Yeah, I was with him in the conference.
Yeah, well, it's a shame for him because he writes about Sinai. I'm sure you know why he's not here. My question about him is that the reason for him being detained again and again appears to be that he is disseminating news which is either obviously against the state, which is a lie anyway, and that he's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or something to that effect, which is a complete lie. I don't know how.
Finally, can I ask you to identify yourself, please? If you're comfortable. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we have regional support and Sisi alone, and then North Sinai will violence call for more violence, and so if that.
And also why are so-called terrorists continuing to be possibly effective? I have some ideas myself, but I would certainly like.
Sorry, who are you referring to when you refer to so-called terrorists in this case?
I'm referring to Ansar Bakto.
Okay.
I think they're known now. Well, they're doing Islam as well. They're known as lots of
names. Okay. Yeah. So maybe we start from here, perhaps.
Okay. Well, I won't. I'm going to defer to Omar on Sinai questions. So just the other two. There's a question on foreign governments, and then related to that, how isolated is the regime? I guess you mean both kind of geopolitically and also within Egypt, within the kind of ruling apparatus. The first part of that, I'd say, certainly financially heavily dependent, more on Gulf nations than on kind of Western states, although the political capital that's provided by Western political leaders is hugely important. I was lucky, in inverted commas, enough to be at the Sharm el-Sheikh Economic Development Conference last March, which was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. and I mean, they basically should have been the theme tune to the Lego movie, Everything is Awesome, playing down all of the corridors all the time, because you had world leader after world leader. I think it was 18 different heads of state, as well as a whole host of kind of multinational executives and so on, queuing up to enumerate to anyone who's been watching or paying close attention to Egypt for the past few years, the very same kind of features economically and politically that we had under Mubarak, and saying, isn't it amazing that Egypt is now entering this great new dawn, from John Kerry to Christine Lagarde to Philip Hammond. So I think that political support is important, and certainly the regime plays off it domestically to a certain degree, and it's a difficult balancing act because the regime wants to, promote the chauvinistic, hyper-nationalistic, we don't care what other people think, it's us against the world, whilst at the same time showing pictures of Sisi on the red carpet at Downing Street and saying, look how accepted he is in the international corridors of power. Financially, though, it's all about the Gulf. We could spend another 5 hours talking about the extent to which the Gulf nations, and particularly Saudi Arabia, are really the principal bankrollers of reaction in the Middle East. And when we tell the story not just about Egypt but about the Arab uprisings and revolutions over the past half decade, and very much the story of the counter-revolutions, the Saudi Arabia has to be absolutely the heart of that story. So yes, I think, as others have alluded to, the fact that there are cracks in that relationship. I don't know. I don't have enough insight into the behind-the-scenes nuances of those kind of divisions, and I don't think that either the Emirates or Saudi or Kuwait are going to withdraw their financial backing from Sisi to a dangerous degree anytime soon, because they, like the rest of the Egyptian ruling elite, have invested so much political capital in Sisi being the answer. But it's a point of vulnerability for the regime, certainly.
Zeyad.
Well, about are they economically dependent? Totally they are. And yeah, like you said, there have been a lot of talks about cracks in this kind of relationship, and that's why they're more threatened at the moment, because if they lose the Gulf support, especially economically, they don't have anything to offer. As per, they're socially isolated, if I understood correctly. Well, thing is, they created this kind of a bubble, which is hyper-nationalistic and based on totally unrealistic expectations and totally unrealistic realism. Nothing makes sense. You would have people in the media calling, I remember I was in a cab, and then there was this radio show, and it's at 8 in the morning, one of the most listened to shows, and there is someone who's supposedly an academic talking about, let's dig another River Nile, so that we have nothing to do with the Nahda in Ethiopia. And the guy, the taxi driver he looked at me and he was like, yeah, you know what, if it was 2 years ago, I'd have never believed that, but now the army is capable of doing everything. But then this same person, I'm definite, if I see him again 3 months afterwards, he would just be making fun of them. Because they kept on promising things, and the only way for them to remain of any relevance is that there has to always be a threat. Be it anything, be it all the countries in the world, definitely all the countries in the world are against Egypt. You would have a problem with all the minorities there is. I remember I once talked with someone, and he was talking about those ant worshippers that live somewhere that wants to push Egypt into worshipping ants. So people just making anything up, and you have a lot of media shows and talk shows where people say things that absolutely, it's nothing. And they think that the people are actually believing them and yeah, we are in a conspiracy. Maybe they fell for that for a very brief moment of time, and they thought about the security and the safety, but then few months afterwards, there is nothing. There is no safety, there is no security, and everything is overly expensive, and there is an economic catastrophe in Egypt at the moment. So now they're okay, we trusted you, but as was said earlier, people are not stupid at the end. I would give you 1 chance, 2 chances for something, but then if you're not delivering on that, then it's not going to happen. Would that make them isolated from the society? I think they are, And I think they kept on telling a lot of lies, and they lived in this kind of lies, and they believed it. And for some reason, they think people are believing them, but that's not correct. That's per security in Sinai, of course.
Internationally, away from Saudi and the UAE, Egypt is seen as a partner for security and stability in the region, particularly by Europe. It's seen as a partner to counter the threat from ISIS, and as one of the few countries that is stable in comparison to Libya and Syria. Of course, as we know and have been discussing, that's a really false sense of security and a very short-sighted sense of what stability actually is, particularly as bombings are still taking place on a very regular basis, claimed by Sinai province, etc. And whilst the ingredients for what led to the uprising in 2011, including heavy and brutal repression, are still going on in a much worse economic environment than what was in 2010. So I don't see Egypt as being isolated on the international stage, and certainly the relationship with Saudi and the UAE is based on a financial relationship, but also with the UAE on the war in Libya, and with Saudi, of course, Egypt's providing air force and manpower in Yemen. And on the question about Ismail Iskandarani and this claim of being a member of the banned Muslim Brotherhood group, it's not so surprising that they have put that charge. He's still in pre-trial detention, so it's something that we certainly at Amnesty document quite regularly. When they arrest someone, they'll put a number of fabricated charges on a person, and being a member of a banned group, whether they name it or not, is quite a common one. Sometimes they'll call them, they'll specify of the banned Muslim Brotherhood group, or they'll just say the banned group, a banned group. I mean, in the lead up to the crackdown ahead of this 25th of January anniversary, they even made up the banned 25th of January movement, which no one had even heard of. So yeah, it's not surprising that they have kind of put that charge against him, but the process of investigation has obviously been flawed and unfair. He was questioned for quite a few hours without the presence of a lawyer. So it's probably 99% a false charge, and just not to be alarmed that these are charges, fabricated charges, will often put on people.
Omar.
On the regional dimension, well, the alliances now are, if you looked at them, are based on few threats. So we have the Iran threat, and then the IS threat, and the Ikhwan threat. And the ones who seem to think fundamentally that the Ikhwan are a threat to the stability are mainly the Sisi regime and the UAE. The others, Saudi Arabia under King Abdullah used to prioritize the Ikhwan dimension, but now the priority is for Iran. And the problem with that is that since they gave the new regime over $20 billion in cash aid and others, they expected more support from Sisi in Yemen, and to maybe stop financing for giving funds and giving military advice and security advice to Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, because they are on the other side of that war. But that did not happen. So the cooperation with Bashar continued, and continued intensely, especially in terms of sending arms and sending intelligence support. And the cooperation in Yemen was at the minimum, not as they wanted. And the Saudis are really leading in Yemen, so they need some assistance. So that made the relations a bit tense in that sense. For the Americans, they see that the priority is IS. Lesser so Iran and the Ikhwan are not even on that. So it's mainly IS, and the regime is trying to sell in Egypt is trying to sell that it is fighting IS on its ground, which is right, but it's fighting it in a very wrong way that the Americans are very pissed at. They're basically doing every wrong. The field manual of counterinsurgency that the Marine Corps of the Army produced, and basically based on their experience in Iraq in 2007, they're doing everything wrong with compared to that manual. So that's making the Americans a bit more on the edge with what's happening inside. And that's why the regime at the same time, and this brings us to Ismail Skandarani's case, basically they want to monopolize the speaking about security and counterinsurgency and counterterrorism abroad. So the only narrative you have to give abroad is to, I just came from a conference where they had a presentation now. They were, of course, extremely annoyed by the term coup, by the term Omar Ashour, but that aside, they were extremely annoyed by the term insurgency. They don't want to call it an insurgency, given that insurgency has nothing to do with legitimacy or illegitimacy. It has to do with how they organize themselves. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear only terrorism. What's happening is just terrorism, and you're trying to tell them terrorism is a tactic. Insurgency tells you something about the organization, but this is all just say insurgency, you're from the Muslim Brothers, or you're cheering for the insurgency. So they want to monopolize that, and part of what Ismail was doing is giving a very different narrative from what's happening inside. And of course, many would hear him because they want to know what's happening inside. Ismail was relying on a few local journalists who were providing the information for him, and he would disseminate it outside. So they were very angry with that. So the case of Ismail basically came, I think, they claim otherwise now, but I think it came from the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the German Council of Foreign Affairs. They had this workshop about Sinai in Berlin. I was the keynote speaker. They said to everybody, the German Foreign Affairs Council, that the Egyptians objected. The Minister of Foreign Affairs himself contacted the German Minister of Foreign Affairs and wanted this workshop, which is basically this table and a group of researchers talking to each other. Nothing, no audience, nothing big, and they wanted this to be cancelled. And if it was not cancelled, this would happen and so on. We went anyway. Some people coming from Egypt did not go. And Ismail said in the middle of it, there was official representation, so you had a guy who's deputy minister of the youth ministries, youth minister in Egypt, and a few guys from the state-funded Ahram think tank. And they were taking notes, and Ismail said that the regime was committing crimes against humanity in Sinai, and that was noted, I think. And then the rest of the story is on Sinai. Well, the problem goes, this needs a whole other lecture, but very briefly, this is a 15 years old problem. It's not a, so it's basically started after the Second Palestinian Intifada, when the regime believed that there is direct support coming from northeast Sinai to Gaza Palestinian groups. It started cracking down there quite heavily, and then it mutated in different stages. In 2004, 2006, there was an urban terror campaign. The regime responded by arresting thousands of Bedouins, electrocuted many of them in the genitals, held many of them in Cairo's prisons. Some of those detained who had nothing to do with the bombings, but now they're leaders in the insurgency. The most famous is
Is he from Seoul?
No, he's from the Fakhriya tribe in Fakhriya clan in Arish.
Well, you tell us later, perhaps. So why don't you finish here?
Kamal Alem,
Sorry, okay?
Kamal Alem. He was arrested back in 2004 after the bombings. Nothing to do with the bombings, and now he's actually one of the leading military commanders there. Sometimes they say he's the leader of the group, but he's not. So you have a direct relation between repression and radicalization. But things took a different level in 2009. The bombings of the gas pipelines happened in 2009, mainly after Hamas in Gaza cracked on the Salafi jihadists in Rafah. Some of the organizations there, especially Ansar Jundullah, and you had a movement from those guys into Mubarak Sinai at that time, from Gaza to Northeast Sinai. And this is when things also started to take a different shape back then. And then in 2011, the uprising in Sinai was a mix of a popular mobilization with tactics. When the police started firing, many of the Sinaians started firing back. And 2011, basically Rafah and Sheikh Zayed were security-free zones, so there was no police there. But 2013, it was especially after August 2013. Many there thought that the torture is on its way. So 2004, 2006 will be repeated again, and this is when really the insurgency started to recruit significant numbers, and the rest is history. Sorry, I have to.
Thanks. So there were a few hands up. I remember. Yes, I remember you and any others. Back there. Okay, you go first.
This was really impressed at the author of the Egypt, the Egyptian Radical story. I'm a first-year student here at the LSE. I'm sorry, this sounds slightly incoherent. I'm just trying to understand what you meant by when you said that you tell the stories as a corrective to the elite medium. So, like, what?
Sorry, say that again.
You told the stories of the ordinary citizens as a corrective to the elite medium. So, could you further expand on how you attempt to reconstruct the dimensions of the revolution outside of the old ways?
And yes, back there.
My name is Mahmoud. I'm a British Egyptian activist. I want to talk more about practical steps for now and what happened in the past 2.5 years. We're talking about 2.5 years since the military coup took place, and that was literally the end of the democratic transition, however you want to describe it. What happened to the opposition? That's what I want to ask. It's been 2.5 years now. I was in Egypt summer 2013, and I personally witnessed the Raqqa massacre. And I was there for a period after, and I saw that the Muslim Brotherhood or the anti-coup movement was protesting on literally a day-to-day basis, and they still are. You might not see on mainstream media, but it's pockets here and there. Obviously, they can't go into mainstream events and stuff like that. But they'll literally just be shot dead. And they still are being shot dead, even just inside them. What's happened to the opposition? Everyone, literally every single person said that there's light. Oh, don't ever think that the moving's over. It's going to happen again. The revolution is still there. Quite frankly, what's happened?
Okay.
It's been 2.5 years. There's the liberal movement. There's the anti-coup movement. There's the Muslim Brotherhood. Why are they just not uniting? And what's going on? We're just going to continue like this. And we're going to keep having this event every year, and we're just going to discuss.
That's clear. Okay. And any other questions? Is that a question? Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I've got two. First thing.
Well, maybe briefly, yeah.
Okay. First of all, about the Egyptian political process. Now we have one main problem, which is recognizing the leader. So before we had in the days of Nasser, in the days of Mubarak, where they said that Egypt is the mother, Mubarak is the father, and then we had the days now of Sisi, where we had the bride, the cake, and all of the other Sisi artifacts still sold and shown everywhere. Second question is about the Egyptian media. Now we have around now, how many media channels are 25, and you open at them, and each and everyone says the exact same thing. How much did that play effect? Because we had some dissident voices, and they were almost all shut down. Now we all have the exact same thing, being repeated again and again and again and again. How much does that affect the conscience of the Egyptians? I mean, their process. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we start from the center. Nadine, you want to start, right?
There's one.
I've seen your hands up before. Yes, please do.
So my question, I think it's the same, but it's so exactly how young revolutionists can deal with the army, and especially by army I don't mean like the soldiers, but like military leaders, and with their putting it into account like their power, especially their economic power.
Okay, so we have a question that is specifically regarding your book, and we get there. And what happened to the opposition, specifically the non-Muslim Brotherhood opposition, if I understand correctly?
All opposition.
All opposition. Okay, all right. Media, and how do we make another revolution, basically? Yeah. Okay, so it's another opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it's your question about opposition is so broad, and as you say, protests will happen on the peripheries of Cairo, though we don't see it in mainstream media. I still see there being opposition. It's just it comes in different forms. So it's really and when you do see the opposition, it's so brave, you know. So when I was in Cairo in November, there was I saw students protesting. These were the MA and PhD students who were protesting because they weren't getting appointed into jobs. And you know, the scenes were so reminiscent of 2010, where there were just like groups of protesters outside the Mugamma and completely surrounded by CSF officers. And then you have, you know, movements online, people who. So in response, recently there was the Stop Negi Shahada, you know, Twitter hashtag where it became a trending hashtag, and people were you know, criticizing a judge who's really famous for handing out mass death sentences. And then in response to the mass crackdown ahead of 25th of January, you had you know, because they were going around trying to find someone who participated in 25th of Jan, and then they arrest them. So they launched another Twitter campaign to say, I participated in 25th of Jan. So, and there are human rights organizations that are still working on the ground on documenting and publicizing and doing campaigns, particularly on enforced disappearances, of which the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists and Morsi supporters are bearing the brunt of the crackdown. So I still see that there is opposition. It's just not unified in the ways that we have seen them in the past around political parties, around one particular demand. It's quite fragmented. So much of the opposition has gone abroad, but it's still there, and I think it's worthy of just sort of noting them and keeping our eyes open to various pockets of dissent and in the various forms that it comes in, and seeing where that goes. And in terms of your question about media, it is really problematic that anyone who's critical of the government gets threatened, gets shut down. And I find it particularly problematic when it comes to reporting on North Sinai, because there's very little independent reporting on what's happening in North Sinai, and even when you attempt to do that, you get arrested, and not just by the government, but also by citizens who will then report you as being an agent. And just on Sunday, a TV journalist had her program cancelled because the government insisted that her show would be used to celebrate National Police Day, not talk about what 25th of January was about. So unfortunately you have, there are still some outlets that are critical, like El Bidaya, for example, I feel offers a sort of critical coverage of what's happening and gives space to that. Shuruq also runs, and Mada Masr, of course. But increasingly, vocal spaces of opposition online are shut down, and it does affect the way that people receive information, and therefore how you process and understand what's going on. So it's problematic. But again, there are these small outlets that continue to be critical. It's just a shame that the masses don't know about them.
Yeah, I'll talk about the media because this is where I come from. So yeah, it is problematic. But again, the media, for example, during Morsi's rule, which is unfortunately is one of the moments where the media had the most freedom, yet they didn't have freedom. Like, you were being told, working in the media in 2012-13, that you can talk about the government as much as you want, you can talk about the president as much as you want, but you can never talk about the army. So it wasn't really a freedom of anything. And same thing as was said earlier, like you would get like cold coffee at the presidential palace, and that's it. He wasn't really in charge of many things that were happening. So it cannot be seen as a period of freedom of media. There was freedom, but it wasn't free. On the other hand, now you have the law against terrorism that says that if a reporter saw something with his own eyes and reported on it, something that's not the same exact what's written in the official statement, you're a terrorist. So I still remember before coming here, like I think 5-6 months ago, it was 2 a.m. I'm staying at home, and then there is this sound of a bang, like a really big bang. And then I go on Twitter, and everyone is saying, like, all across Cairo, that everyone heard the bang. And no one can report on that, because you have to wait for an official statement. I remember someone from Madam Masra, I don't remember whom, she called, like, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Interior, like, there is a bang, what's happening? And he told her, this is not a good time to speak because he was asleep. So everyone has to wait until the following day, and you'll be reporting on something, breaking news, 12 hours after it actually happened, because you have to be with the same. So it is a problem. But at the same time, although I used to work in the media, I still am, but the thing is, I don't like to overestimate the power of media at the end, because people, at the end, they know this is not right. They don't need to know what's happening in, for example, if I live in Luxor, I don't have to know what's happening in the north to be upset, because there is enough happening that I'm seeing for my own self that it doesn't seem right. It would give a vent, having like this kind of, as if there is a freedom of media or freedom of information, it would give a vent, which I personally don't want to be this vent to be, so that people at some point will just like take it somewhere. Where is the opposition? How to make another revolution? What's happening? If I know the answer to any of these questions, I would be like the happiest person on earth. I wouldn't be sitting here because I don't know. I don't think anyone does. We can just like theorize as much as we want about what people want and what the opposition should do and what should have done differently and what. But this would be a loop that will never end and will not reach anything. We are yet to figure this out, but not now.
Omar, do you want to comment on
that? Just briefly on the opposition, I mean, it's between prison and exile. And I think yesterday, Ayman Noor was speaking with a former presidential candidate and one of the leading liberal figures in terms of opposition. And he was saying, the main difference between us should not be the objective. The main difference now is that some of us are wearing white, which is, meaning that you're detained but without charge or without sentence. Some of us are wearing blue, which means that you're sentenced. And some of them are wearing red, which means that you're sentenced to death. But of course, there is a weight outside. And to be honest, I'm surprised that there are still demonstrations going on in a situation where you are faced with bullets immediately without warning. I'm still surprised that there are enough people that still challenge this and go down and demonstrate. The bulk of opposition abroad should not be underestimated. I think they could do much better, but what they're doing is a major noise. Whether in terms of satellite televisions and coming, or in terms of attempting to lobby on a political level or on legal level. Some of them attempted the legal course. It was not very successful, but these things I think will continue. One of the main issues is that they don't have an overarching organizational structure so far, mainly because the period of 2011, 2013 left so many bitter feelings. And also in terms of the objective, there's still no objectivity, because if you go on with, let's say, we're going to unite, then you will lose portions of your supporters, because the unity agreement will not be agreed upon by several factions within your supporters. And that's what's keeping things, I think, so far. But what I'm trying to tell everybody, that collectively, the opposition now is a lot weaker than only one faction within the regime. Basically all of the opposition is weaker than the military establishment put together. So if you're that weak while you're united, then you have no chance of it. You're still divided. So, sorry?
So what should we just give up?
No. You should unite and then act. It's a long struggle, but it's there's no giving up. You have no chance to give up. Thousands got killed. 40,000 now are in jail. It can get worse. So basically, also another thing, you reach rock bottom. So from now on, you have no way except to go up. So.
All right, and Jack.
I'll be very quick because I'm guessing we're pretty much out of time and we're wrapping up. On the opposition, very briefly, I think it's a hugely important question. It's the question, and surprisingly enough, I don't have a definitive answer, and I don't think anybody does. I will say that I think the debates which have been happening, or at least the beginnings of the debates, which I'm sure you're very aware of, within revolutionaries within Egypt, and they've been very divisive debates over the extent to which there should be alliances between the tendency that we might call the kind of 6th of April, I don't want to say secular because I think it's a slightly misleading term, but what is commonly described as kind of secular revolutionaries with members of the Muslim Brotherhood. The revolutionary socialists have obviously kind of made advances in that direction. Other members of the kind of democratic left have reacted very badly to the revolutionary socialist suggestion that there should be at least more of an understanding, if not kind of a formal alliance. I don't have an answer to those questions, and I know that's a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's really important that those debates continue, and I think it's crucially important that all revolutionaries, and this goes for everything I've said as well, that there is a huge distinction to be made between opposition to Morsi's presidency and the Muslim Brotherhood leadership and the hundreds of thousands of Muslim Brotherhood members and wider supporters, many of whom I believe are committed revolutionaries and absolutely want the best for Egypt and absolutely have to be a part of bringing down this oppressive dictatorship. In terms of your question, I'll be very quick because I know it's very specific to me, but and by all means email me and we can talk more about it. But just in terms of trying to provide a different perspective, what I meant by that is I think the main framing of the revolution for the past 5 years, through its high points and low points in the international media and international commentators, has been to take as the starting point elites and counter-elites jockeying for position amid the chaos. And it's not that I don't think that those movements, those day-to-day power struggles aren't important. They are. What I'm trying to do in my book is say these are coming on top of a much deeper fissure, which is between the division between large sections of the Egyptian population and a broken model of state power. And so what I try and do in my book is I go to communities, I mentioned some of them before, all around Egypt, from domestic cleaners in Esbet el-Hagena, women who have started up their own independent trade union movement and are not just fighting against the state, they're fighting against the old male-dominated traditional trade union movement in Egypt, right up to communities that are resisting eviction and so on. So I believe that by telling those stories, you can get a lot more out of, get a lot more understanding about the revolutionary process. And completely final thing, you mentioned the Sisi bride, Sisi mania. I returned to my apartment in Cairo in August last year, which for complicated reasons I've been away from for about 6 months. And as you would expect when you leave any apartment for 6 months in Cairo, I came back, it was in the middle of a heat wave, had about this much dust on the floors, the gas had been cut, the electricity had been cut because I hadn't paid my bills, and so everything in the fridge had melted, and when I opened it was just this sort of ecosystem of like soggy mould, and there was one thing in that fridge which had survived, and it's the scariest thing in the world. It's a box that someone had ironically given me as a joke birthday present of Sisi chocolate, and his face remains there. And all I can say is let's get it out in the sun and melt it.
Right. There was one final point which I somehow banalized and say, how do we make another revolution? And unfortunately, we're running out of time. But let's put it this way: if you had to send, say, a tweet now to Egypt and say, what would be the best advice that you can give, say, as a tweet to those Egyptians who would like to read that tweet and listen to it? I don't know. Tough one, I know.
See, I'm the most prolific
tweeter.
So I feel like you should...
just tell Egypt good luck.
Egypt good luck. Anything more specific?
I would say never give up hope, and the struggle always continues.
I would say that at every stage of the past half decade, people have told us, well, now the story's over, and every time new chapters keep on getting written. But I'd compress it.
That's a long one. How far do you have to do?
Yeah, you paid the high price already, so stay brave and keep resisting.
Right, I think we should thank all of them very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, somebody else built up. So it was you now.
Sure.